Bruce Pascoe, thank you so much for joining me. How are you?
Very well, thank you.
Great, wonderful. Firstly, I just want to say I've read Dark Emu twice now, and absolutely blew my mind, that book. I have to admit my Australian history is a bit shoddy, actually, and I'm just kind of really actually taking much more of an interest in it later in life, and all the more reason why that book really just kind of blew my mind, and just how much I just didn't know any of this kind of stuff. So thanks for writing the book. It's an incredible book. But yeah, I was wondering whether maybe you could maybe just say a little bit about yourself and the kind of work that you do.
Yeah, I'm a Yuin Bunurong Tasmanian man with English and Cornish heritage. I'm a writer, and these days I'm a farmer as well, because we need to demonstrate that Aboriginal people are still in contact with the old food systems. We've got a lot of Yuin people working on the farm in order to make sure that no one can ever say we've lost contact with our history.
Right. Is the type of farming that you're doing much more in line with the kind of Aboriginal the Aboriginal agriculture,
Yeah.
that you describe in the book?
Yeah, that's all we do. We grow the plants, the grasses and tubers that I talk about in Dark Emu, and we do that because despite the fact that Dark Emu was very successful as a book, and Australian people got very excited about that history, there was no flow through to Aboriginal people. There was no inclusion of Aboriginal people in the farming sector. So we had to take control of the traditional agricultural systems, and we don't want to exclude people from those systems, but we do need to be part of it, because we're sick and tired of people talking airily about Aboriginal employment and doing nothing about it. And we think there's a huge potential to employ Aboriginal people in Australian agriculture and forestry. Right.
Fantastic. In short, I mean, sorry, this is a very broad question, but how have Aboriginal people been completely, grossly misrepresented? And through Dark Emu, what is kind of the truth of the matter that you've been writing about?
Well, the misrepresentation is part of colonial rule number one. That is to try and infer that the existing population, First Nation people, when discovered by Europeans, were not worthy of the soil. And in fact, quite often were not worthy of being called human. Now, that's the way the colonists worked right around the globe. By the time they got to Australia, one of the last places to be colonised, the method of the colony was refined to a scalpel fineness. And so we've been battling that misconception ever since. And the perception is that Aboriginal people had no accomplishments beyond the Stone Age. And you could see that operating in the right-wing press to an extraordinary extent. And so we're just trying to redress the balance to make sure that Australians know that Aboriginal people were engaged in an agricultural endeavour, but also that we had managed the forest of Australia by the use of weeding, but predominantly by fire for 65,000 years or more. And so that's our work. Our work is to argue against the colonial myth.
How recent has this colonial myth been pushed? Is it still kind of being pushed in the present day?
Yeah, look, there's a well-organised bunch of people who call themselves the Quiet Australians. They're the noisiest people I know, and they are dedicated to resisting the idea that Aboriginal people had any competence whatsoever. And the basis of that work is to prevent Australia from doing anything in regard to recompense, anything in regard to treaty, anything in regard to voice to Parliament. It's a really nasty, uninformed campaign. I don't think these people are unintelligent. I think they're deliberately trying to sway Australians with misinformation, and there's the nastiness. The want to misinform current Australian children, in particular. Telling lies to children is really insidious thing. But the thing that has always surprised me is that when I was asked to reanalyse the colonial period by older Aboriginal people, there were two prongs to that request. One was to relieve my own ignorance, but because I was a writer, it was also to write about these things so that wider Australia could learn about it. And that was the job I was given, and that is what I've tried to do over the last 50 years. It's only in recent times that it's become an issue, simply because of the popularity of Dark Emu, and therefore the far right see it as a threat. Therefore, the far right see me as a threat. Therefore, they have to try and dismember me. The situation with Stan Grant is very, very similar. And it just shows how active the far right are in the politics of Australia.
What's their agenda? Is it basically just a power stronghold, or is it much more of a kind of racist ideology that's underlined throughout that kind of? Why are they still holding on to this narrative?
I think they can see the writing on the wall that Australians want to change their mind about colonial Australia. Many Australians now, probably a majority, understand that there was a war for the land in Australia. And, what that leads to, of course, is treaty and recompense. And the far right think that's anathema. Many of them are royalists and don't want to see Australia move away from the British Empire, because they see that as the flower of civilization. And the British Empire did many quite extraordinary things in terms of culture and economics and industry, all of those. There was an incredible burgeoning of advancement, but it was unhinged from social policy. And that's what we have to understand as a world, that the impoverishment of people can be attributed to colonialism and industrialisation to a large extent, and that we need to address it. It doesn't mean that we're communists, because communists have done exactly the same things using a different economic and political model. We're not arguing for communism. We're arguing for decency in human life and morality in human economics. And Aboriginal people practiced a moral economy, and we think Australians have a lot to learn about that. The thing that amazed me when I was studying those books that I mentioned before was the revelation of the material that's included in them, and the fact that really intelligent Australian people had read those books before me. Many of our famous historians, Manning, Clark, etc., had read those books before me and chose not to mention it in their histories. Manning Clark was the darling of the left, and yet he virtually never mentioned Aboriginal people in all the histories of Australia. And that's what stunned me. It stunned me that historians would read that Sir Thomas Mitchell rode through 9 miles of stooped grain. And people say that Mitchell never used the word stook, but he did use the word rick, and it means exactly the same thing, 9 miles of ricked grain. They read that Charles Sturt walked through villages where he estimated the population at about 1,000. And none of those things ever entered the curriculum of Australian schools. That's the thing that stuns me. These really intelligent people, you know, the flowers of our civilization in Australia, chose not to mention the accomplishments of Aboriginal people. That's the surprise to me, and I think it's an insidious indication of the mentality of Australia.
Why do you think that is? I mean, there's is it just because to acknowledge that would just have to be such a radical shift of the lie that we've been fed, and no one has been willing to take that on? I mean, or is it?
Yeah, I think it's exactly that. That it uncovers all sorts of things that a colonial nation doesn't want to uncover, because it talks to the fact that Australia is not based on the true precepts of nationhood. And that's what a lot of people want. A lot of Australians wanted to develop a political system which was based on the equality of the working man, etc., all very fine principles. And they were doing it through the Bulletin magazine, whose masthead at the time was Australia for the White Man. Now, they deliberately were trying to exclude blacks and Asians, but it was just understood they were also trying to exclude Aboriginal people. Now, this philosophy, this egalitarian philosophy, is deeply racist.
What do you think it is about the the colonial explorers that, as you said, was so divorced from a social conscience? And in the book you kind of mentioned, I might be getting my dates wrong, but around the 1800s or so, the Chinese were probably the most developed country in the world, or advanced country in the world, but had done there without the steps that the colonial Europeans took of just abolishing other nations and things. What do you think? Because some people have said there's conflict throughout history and people conquer, but you've kind of demonstrated that that's not exactly how it went. It was a kind of colonial characteristic.
Yeah, when I was studying at university and school, I was told all the time by my history teachers that war was the natural condition of man. As a literature student, I was told that war was the natural condition of man, thus Shakespeare. And I think that's a terribly bleak prospect for a young person to be confronted with. If it's the truth, then it's a source of enormous depression for the Western world. But I don't think it is correct, because in Australia, for 100,000 years or more, Aboriginal people conducted a system of social management that eschewed war. It didn't eschew violence. It didn't eschew greediness. It didn't eschew bad temper, but it did eschew land war. That's a significant thing. Now, a lot of the right wing say, oh, you know, Pascoe says that Aboriginal people never went to war. What about all the violence that, you know, was perpetrated against women, et cetera, et cetera? That is undoubted. You know, it's in our history. You can read it, of bad-tempered men bashing up women, and vice versa to a lesser extent. But it is land war, and this is the complete misrepresentation of Aboriginal law, LORE, because the British had to negate the idea that Aboriginal people had an understanding of ownership. And all our nations are based on particular areas of land and have a particular language for that land. And the philosophical statement about those lands is that Mother Earth is supreme, that we owe our entire allegiance to Mother Earth. It's an ownership thing. It's a care thing. And that is completely misrepresented in all Australian histories, because they argue that in the Quran and in the Bible, man shall have dominion over the earth, which is the direct opposite of Aboriginal belief. And if that can't be understood, then Aboriginal social development will be understood as well. So I'm begging people to consider the fact that here on this continent, probably for the first time and last time, people devised a system of controlling the violent human where land war was eschewed. And if we want to do without war, then we have to consider this system. And that's all I'm asking, for consideration of the system. We can't go back to 1878, but there are many things in Aboriginal philosophy which can be adopted in today's world and would make a huge difference. It would make a huge difference to social policy. It'd make a huge difference to environmental policy, obviously, but it'd also make a huge difference to political policy and the policy of LAW law, so that, you know, European law is so adversarial. Where has that led us? Winners and looters. We now have television programs called The Biggest Loser. This is a terrible thing for a society to get involved with. We should be shocked and ashamed that we laugh at poor people, that we laugh at fat people, that we laugh at the underprivileged. It should shock us, but it doesn't seem to, and that's because our system is so adversarial, winners and losers.
What systems or Aboriginal philosophies could be adopted and like quite immediately? I mean, you were mentioning before the you know, nature being almost like a godlike state. You know, respecting nature as the giver of all life. And really, I suppose that would probably be the quickest mind shift that I would really love to see. But what are some Aboriginal philosophies or systems that you would
yeah, look,
promote?
I think obviously considering the earth as our mother and our allegiance being to her, not the other way around, I think that's crucial. It's a philosophical statement, but I don't see it as being anti-Christian. I don't see it as being anti-Muslim. because you look very closely at the Quran and the great Persian poets and philosophers, and they're referring to an animist system. Christianity sometimes refers to an animist system. I don't think they're contradictory to each other. They don't strike each other out. Christianity is just a philosophy. I think you talk to the senior clerics in any of those religions, and they understand that the stories are sometimes apocryphal. They will tell you that the stories are lessons, not fact. You know, mountains didn't come to Muhammad. You know, the parting of the Red Sea was an atmospheric phenomena that had been witnessed before. So I think the intelligent Christian, the intelligent Muslim understands these things, and they need not separate us. We can come together. This is why so many Aboriginal people are Christian, because they can understand a Christian philosophy, and they can, because Bayami is a being in the sky, it was not a far stretch for Aboriginal people to say, well, yes, you know, God is in the sky, but God is Bayami. You know, that was beaten out of a lot of Aboriginal people, but in the first instances, you can see that Bayami was equated with God. And there's no reason why we can't have that discussion, because it talks about looking after the earth. And if I'm very confident in the younger generation, that the younger generation see that if we don't look after the earth, then we'll become without a home, and that's the end of us. You know, we might be on Mars, but we won't be living a human life on Mars. We'll be living an encapsulated life. And I don't think that's what we want. I think the current generation actually love this earth, the only earth, and want to preserve it. And so if we do that, we have to have philosophical change. And it doesn't mean we swap over to heathenism, and we don't swap over to communism. We swap over to a more realistic spiritual faith. And I grew up in a Christian household, and I became agnostic, not because of the Bible so much, but because of the behaviour of Christians. What I saw as the Christians in authority that I knew personally dismayed me for their shallowness and for their craven behaviour and for their corruption. That totally dismayed me. I was fortunate at around that time to be drawn into Aboriginal life. And the most senior people I met, the most sober and philosophical of those people, showed me that there wasn't so much difference between a good Christian and a good Aboriginal elder. So I've been very fortunate to be guided by people like that over time and introduced to Aboriginal philosophy. And I just think it's so close to normal human philosophy that we'd be stupid to let it go. And there's enormous craving in humans to believe. I don't understand it. I'm still working my way through that idea, that argument. Why do humans with all their skills and capabilities still want to believe in a superior being? Because Aboriginal people did exactly that. Aboriginal people had a spiritual belief in Mother Earth, father sky, grandmother moon, grandfather sun. There was that aching desire to want to believe in something else, and it's to do with the night sky, living under the night sky and understanding that the cosmos is so big and yet we are so small, that I think there was this understanding that there was something else beyond us that we had to recognise. And I think Aboriginal people did it very well. I think the Persians did it pretty well too. But the Aztecs were pretty good at philosophy, but sacrificed virgins. You know, it seems counterproductive to me for people developing spiritual and philosophic systems to then do something as barbaric as take the life of a person to supplicate gods. And it didn't happen in Australia. And I think we need to investigate why. It doesn't mean that there weren't horrors in Australian Aboriginal life, but it does mean there wasn't war for land and there were no prisons or prisoners, and there was an enormous amount of sharing. I'm looking at a hill now right outside this window, and that the hill is a story about sharing. And 80% of the stories and legends that I hear in Aboriginal life are about sharing and about punishing greed. It is a wonderful philosophy, and I think the world can benefit from this concentration on fairness and sharing and avoidance of greed and power. If you're looking for the most powerful person in an Aboriginal community, don't look for the one sitting at the desk. Don't look for the one with the car. Don't look for the one in the suit. Look for the old woman under the tree. She will be holding the power of that community.
Beautiful. How did Dark Emu come to be? What were the early seeds sown, I suppose, in your work and your research, where you kind of started coming across this information and thought, no, this story really needs to be told?
Well, I had been reading, the older Aboriginal people had said you need to refurbish your brain, which sent me back to the library where I checked up on their claims and found them to be correct. But while I was talking about this with university students and professors, I was really encouraged by the amount of interest in those ideas and the amount of people who were on the brink of investigating them. But senior historians and archaeologists took me aside and gave me a virtual rap on the knuckles for trying to indicate that Aboriginal people had any accomplishments. And it was then that I realised that just exposing these texts to a different kind of review was never going to be enough, and that I would have to go beyond the scholarly world and talk directly to Australian people. And so I left that meeting in Canberra and I stopped at the first secondhand bookshop I came to, and I went to the history section. I was looking for explorers' journals, and I came to Thomas Mitchell. Was one of the only books they had, and I read that, and within 100 pages, I'd read that Sir Thomas Mitchell rode through 9 miles of ricked grain where people had been harvesting grain for conversion into flour. And as soon as I read that, because I hadn't been exposed to it before, as soon as I read that, I thought we've been sold a pup. This has been the greatest con trick of all time, and it's time that it stopped. So that's the genesis of Dark Emu. And of course, then I read all sorts of journals, Eyre, Warburton, Leichhardt, and Sturt, of course. Sturt, every Australian should read what Sturt wrote, because he was a good writer and he was a decent man. The historians that I talk to, when we're having these discussions, we wonder aloud if Sturt may have been the only explorer not to kill anyone. And it's terrible to think of our colonial world like that. Was he the only one who didn't murder anyone?
Yeah. It's interesting hearing you talk and write about Sturt and Mitchell. You write about them very fairly and you give them I don't know. I mean, a lot of kind of respect it in a way, but at the same time, you talk about them being empathetic settlers and explorers, but at the same time, not nearly enough to actually change their agenda or stick up for the Aboriginal people. Were there any explorers that you kind of felt like, was there any resistance that you came across in your research of European settlers actually kind of fighting back against the horrific treatment of Aboriginal people? Or was it just kind of a universal get the job done?
There were a few. There was the fella in Western Victoria, Dawson, who was a genuinely good man. He's a good Christian. You'd have to admire him. He worked very hard on behalf of Aboriginal people. But as I point out in Convincing Ground, a book I wrote on the colonial war, Dawson, with all his kindness and love and intelligence and his refinement, intellectual refinement, still took the land of Aboriginal people. So there's that glitch in the colonial mind that can't be passed over. So even the very good people were like that. There were a number of missionaries who were pretty good. Sievewright in Victoria was one of them. I write quite a bit about Sievewright. There's a very good book written about Sievewright called The Hated Protector. It's self-published, unfortunately, and nobody reads this book. And we all should. Every Australian should read it, because here was an Englishman who was doing his darndest to live up to his Christian faith and to treat people respectfully. And he was pilloried by other Christians. He was pilloried by the police, pilloried by politicians. He was the hated protector. There was a guy in Western Australia, a minister there. His name will come to me in a moment. I talk about him particularly in Convincing Ground. He tried very hard to sway his church and to sway his fellow Christians to show humanity towards Aboriginal people. And he failed dismally. He virtually had no support for the very basic compassion of a Christian, to support the dignity of mankind, to support Christian kindness. All the tropes of Christianity, the Good Samaritan, etc., etc. He had almost no success. And it's terrible to read his journal and to read about his life, because I don't know how he kept going, because he was almost a total failure. But he did write it down, and he wrote down this lack of progress in the colony toward any kind of Christian decency. So there were people like that around. Duncan Kep, the young woman in central New South Wales, she was a wonder. Her book is very badly neglected in Australia, and that's the responsibility of the male ego largely. I mean, they didn't like what she said about Aboriginal people because she grew up with Aboriginal people and could speak the language, which is how better to understand a philosophy than to understand the language. But she was treated abysmally. But a lot of it was not just because she was writing about Aboriginal people with sympathy. It was because she was a woman.
What were some of the most incredible discoveries that you came across while writing this book? I mean, there's so much in there. That relationship between the Aboriginal people and the killer whales in fishing was just amazing. Just the extent of the controlled burning to keep everything agriculturally fertile. What were some of the most mind-blowing or incredible revelations that you came across?
Finding about the size of the houses was revelatory. Because I had no exposure to that at all. So few Australians have, and yet in one instance I read where one Western District settler, when negotiating for the land, now he was unusual in that he was negotiating for the land with the people. He went to a meeting and he entered an Aboriginal house, and there were 52 people in there. That's a significant building. In my town, we'd call it a town hall because we don't have buildings. We don't have many big buildings in Mallacoota, but we'd call that a town hall or a community hall. That's what that man had entered. So that was revelatory to me. And, Peter Sutton talks about Budj as being an aberration in Australia. No, it's not. There are Budj right around the country. They look a bit different because the building materials were different and the climate was different. But I've got a non-Aboriginal archaeologist sends me material every fortnight, about villages, Aboriginal villages. That's his passion at the moment, finding out about where people collected together to live together. And look, that's a book on its own, and someone else needs to write it. I hope that person is Aboriginal, but if they're not, I hope they're Australian. I don't want a Canadian to write it. I don't want an Englishman to write it. I want it to be Australia. I want this to be our knowledge. We are owning up to this information. And Australians are going to get very excited. There's a village that this man collected information about it, which is on the public record, where it must have been around colonial times where the people had worked on a piece of land that was hidden by swampland, and they'd built a village inside that to replicate other villages that had been run over and burnt by non-Aboriginal people. But it was like an Eden inside there. For the Europeans who did witness it and described it, they described it in idyllic terms because of the food production, the housing, the way of life. All of this is yet to be known by Australians. Now, some Australians do know it. And, some of the older archaeologists say, we were studying this, Pascoe didn't invent this. No, I didn't invent it. It's on the bloody public record. But why weren't you talking about it? you might have been talking about it to yourselves, but it's not in the curriculum. It is not in the curriculum. It might be creeping in there now, but when I first started going to my grandchildren's schools, the libraries were abominable in this regard. They're inner city schools, but their libraries were shocking. They were as bad as when I went to school. So if they've changed now, well, let's celebrate it. But don't let us imagine that this has been happening for decades, like some of those older historians and archaeologists have been saying. Australians don't know these things. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been shocked by Dark Emu.
Right.
And when they see the film Dark Emu, which comes out in July, I think they'll be stunned, because we're talking in there about a couple of other archaeological sites that are going to shock Australia to the core.
Wow, didn't know there was a film coming out. That's exciting. When I first reached out to you, you said you were on an archaeological dig. Can you share any information about what archaeological digs you've been on?
Yeah, in a few states. I can't talk about Western Australia, unfortunately, but that'll become apparent soon. Really important. I think one of the most important things going around is the understanding of that horticultural sensibility, which is going to be made public soon, about Western Australia, parts of Western Australia. But the one that you will know about is the one in Queensland, up near Windora and Birdsville, where the University of Queensland have been studying a village and mine system, and in between Windora and Birdsville. It's a sensational site. 4 million grinding dishes were mined out of there, probably more, and the vast majority of them, 80 to 90% of them, were traded to other people. Now, the next stage in that science is to find out where they went, and I think we'll find that they went everywhere. That people were carrying these huge items on their heads because they were such a valued addition to the kitchen, and they were an industrial tool. They were enabling people to create flour quicker and better than they ever had before. And the role of the miller, the flour miller in world society, is actually a good thing to study. And because I think it's so significant, I've written a novel about it called Imperial Harvest. But I think Australians are going to be stunned by Mythica. It's already been in a few newspapers, but I haven't seen a ripple of interest in it in the general press. But when you see it, when Australians see it, they're going to want to know about it. And the thing about that is that an old man and I discovered another one which I think is 5 times as big. To the west, I think it's an extraordinary site. I think it's got some features that'll shock people to their bloody core. It shocked me to my core. It shocked my old brother. You know, it's his land. He'd never seen it. And it shocked him to his core because of what it said about the human spirit. And that's what I want Australians to know. I want Australians to know that they live in the country where this human spirit was developed, refined, and existed, and still exists today. Because my old brother, he's teaching his young people about that. He's teaching his young people about a refinement of the human mind and the human spirit, which I think has been unmatched in the world. And it doesn't make us better than anyone else. what it means is our circumstances were possibly different, but we use those circumstances to create something to defy the idea that war is the natural condition of man, and therefore the pinnacle of our literature will be William Shakespeare. I don't think William Shakespeare understood the human condition as well as some of those old people. And certainly some of the old people down here, their mantra was patience, tolerance and respect. It wasn't power, money and God. It was patience, tolerance and respect of all humans. You know, I look forward to a time when most people on earth will see that as their heart's desire.
Yeah, beautiful. What were some of the ripple effects of Dark Emu, the cultural significance and the ripples throughout culture? You know, it seemed like has been a bit of a game changer in recent you know, history of how people are viewing our Australian history. How was it received, and yeah, what effects has it had?
I think Australians were looking for another way of seeing their country. I think so many Australians that I've spoken to found the story of Australia's development unbelievable. Found the story of how Europeans won the land to be just unbelievable. You know, just didn't make any sense that a people would give up the land so easily, because our books don't talk about war. And, you know, there was a war, and our people started the war late because war was unknown. Land war was unknown. The philosophy of land war was unknown. But humans are very adaptive. So within about 5 or 10 years, Aboriginal people realised that Europeans were not going to come within the gracious acceptance of the land. They had no, you know, white men can't jump, but white men can't think about egalitarianism either. And it took our people a while to understand that that was the philosophical case, and then to develop a defence against it. And there is a really good book to be written on the state of mind of Aboriginal people and how they reacted to that knowledge, because some kept on persisting with the idea that eventually Europeans would understand that the earth is our mother and you couldn't own her. So many people persisted with that idea, whereas some people decided, no, enough's enough, we're going to war. And at least half of those people were women. There was an excellent case in Tasmania of a woman who knew so much about Christians so early and so horribly, and you can imagine the horror. She decided there was no point in conversation. She decided she'd have to go to war. So she led a group of men and women in retaliation. She didn't think she was going to win. So imagine the despair in that woman's mind. But she thought there was no point in appeasement of non-Aboriginal people.
Do you think where positive change is coming? You know, we're in a very...
I do.
Yeah.
I do. I have a lot of faith in young Australians. I think a lot of young Australians are absolutely determined that the world will be better, that our choices will be better, that our morality will be better. And I'm not 100% convinced of that, but because I have 4 grandchildren, I have to fight for long enough to give those intelligent 4 children a chance to do something. I have lived long enough to see my children do it, but I want my grandchildren to have that chance, and their children and their children and their children. We're changing a forest on this farm to more closely represent the old Aboriginal forest. It'll take us 70 years to do that. I'll be long gone by the time the results of that work are through, but that's what we have to do. We have to imagine it now, plan for it now, and have enough children of aspiring minds to see it through. And I think that's what capitalism cannot do. That's what our current political system cannot do. It cannot imagine a time 70 years hence when the politician or the landowner or the landlord isn't alive and want for those people to live a good life. That's what we should all aspire to. When I'm gone, I want those great grannies, unknown to me and perhaps unrelated to me, I want them to have a good life. And that's not what, we are not imagining that in our political system today. But young people are. I've seen young people working in the Pacific, for instance, for people whose islands are going to drown within the next 20 years, working absolutely selflessly with those people because they can imagine a better world.
Have there been many changes as a result of the book? For instance, agriculturally, I know in the book you mentioned that there is someone at Monash who has done a terrific job of making a Aboriginal garden that's I think growing a lot of native vegetables and things like that. Has there been a resurgence in that?
Yeah, there has been. And the person you're referring to is Beth Gott. She died 6 months ago. She started before me. She imagined a better world. You know, Beth Gott should be a hero. If we're going to have, paper money, she should be on one of those bits of paper money. A lot has changed and a lot will change. There are so many people, young people into permaculture and wanting to do these things. The big deficiency is that they don't always work out how Aboriginal people are going to be rewarded for this knowledge, acknowledged for it and included in the future. That's the big gap in Australia. Even really good-hearted people, I have to say to them, what you've done there is great. That garden you've got of Murnong, fantastic. How are the local Aboriginal people benefiting from that? And they haven't even thought about it. And it's a great shame because they're intelligent people, but they haven't even thought about it. One of the other ways things have changed is death threats against me and death threats against other people, death threats against Stan Grant, death threats against some of the most gracious women in Australia, simply because some men, and they're mostly men, are so opposed to the idea of this better world.
Yeah. Just a threat to their stronghold?
Yeah. And some of them I know, believe very firmly in their ideas, but we have to keep talking with them. Some of them are malicious. There's no doubt about that. Some of them are just plain nasty. and cruel and violent. There's no doubt about that. But some of them just have a philosophy that is so wedded to Western excellence that they can't see beyond it.
What are you working on at the moment, Bruce?
A book of poetry, a play, a film script, 2 novels.
Wow.
And 2 books of non-fiction. And I finished first draft of a book on this farm on Friday. By next Friday, I'll have started a revision of a first draft of a book on Aboriginal stars. Yesterday, I collected all the poems together for a collection. By August, I hope to have done all the reading for a book which I'm calling The European Mind, about trying to understand your very first question, which was what happened when Europeans invented big ships. Because the Chinese had big ships, and we haven't talked about that enough. The Chinese visited Australia and other continents, so it seems, and did so to trade. A completely different mindset. A mindset that came with curiosity and economic ambition, but not land ambition. The Chinese came, they traded, they took wives, and they took men to China who found wives in China and came back. Thus, we have so many Chinese Aboriginal names in this country. They did that and traded. That is a really significant moment in world history. And so in one of the books I'm writing, I'm trying to understand what was it about the European that made the Europeans so violent.
Do you have any theories?
Religion, the Christian religion. I think when you say man shall have dominion over the earth, you also, what you are inferring is that man is European and he's white.
Right, right. I really, really look forward to reading more of your books, Bruce. As I've said, read Dark Emu twice. I've got another one on Audible, and but it seems like Audible only scratches the surface of the amount of work that you've done. So I'll be definitely looking up much more of your work. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk with you, mate. It's been incredibly enlightening, actually. And thank you so much for all the work that you do.
Well, good on you. Thanks very much, Jack. I'll see you down the track.
Great. Thank you, mate. All the best. Thanks for listening, everyone. Bye.